You're listening to the Fantasy Takeaway Podcast with Murphy Hamilton and Joe Pollock. Proud member of the Full-Time Fantasy Podcast Network. Subscribe, listen, take home the title.
All right, what's up, Takeaway Nation? We are back for part 2 of this wide receiver running back review. We went a little long yesterday on running backs, so we're going to do a whole second show to dive into wide receivers. And of course, we are rejoined by Chris McConnell of the RotoBros podcast. Chris, God, we got so much to talk about, don't we?
We do. We obviously went a little long on running backs, but look, again, we talked about it yesterday. The running backs and wide receivers move the needle, and so we really got a lot of information for both positions. We really took a deep dive into running backs. So this wide receiver episode is going to be great. And of course, we'll also mention the 2020 buys and sells for running backs and wide receivers as well. We got some names to kind of throw out there. So this is going to be a lot of fun. I'm really excited. Thanks you guys for having me back on here.
Joe, you ready?
Let's do it, man. I felt like we did really well on wide receivers in our initial episode about wide receivers right before the season. So few victory laps are coming here.
Yeah, I want you guys to just go ahead and picture Joe's in like an 80s tracksuit with the headband, and he's doing his stretches right now because he's about to just run circles on this show. All right, that's the tease. Let's dive into it. We're going to start with the good. As with last episode, we have the good, the shockingly good, what we expected, the bad, and the other, the players whose value isn't shown in the final rankings. So the good is the top 3. Michael Thomas, number 1. Number 2, asterisk. We're going to talk about him in the shockingly good. And number 3, Julio Jones. Let's focus on Michael Thomas to start. Just, my God, this guy is ridiculous, setting record after record after record. In a year when you have Lamar Jackson, Christian McCaffrey, and Michael Thomas all playing at once, this was just outstanding.
Dude, I honestly don't really know what to say about Michael Thomas. His season, I think, was shocking to anyone because nobody expected anybody to break that single season receptions record, let alone shatter it. It was a really, really solid season for Michael Thomas. And I think even he showed with Teddy Bridgewater, even with a mediocre quarterback, he can still be a more than relevant fantasy option.
I'm going to quote you. What you say about Michael Thomas is something you say on several episodes. He good.
He good.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's really good, to say the least. Michael Thomas led all wide receivers, obviously, in targets and receptions. As far as from a target standpoint, he had almost 30 more targets than Julio Jones on the season. And he had 45 more receptions than any other wide receiver. The next 2 closest were DeAndre Hopkins and Keenan Allen. So just to put that in perspective, there was a bigger gap in receptions between Michael Thomas and Keenan Allen, DeAndre Hopkins, than the amount of receptions that Tyrell Williams had, Juju Smith-Schuster, Alshon Jeffrey, just about as much as T.Y. Hilton. Like, this was an incredible season from Michael Thomas. Shockingly good. We knew it was going to be really good, but we didn't know it was going to be this shockingly good. Almost 1,800 all-purpose receiving yards, and he was phenomenal. By far the wide receiver 1. He outscored wide receiver 2, DeAndre Hopkins, by about a little less than 110 points. So in total. So just absolutely incredible. I think he was the only wide receiver this year as well that was over 20 fantasy points per game. He was at 23.4, edging out Chris Godwin by about 4 points in total. So unbelievable year for Michael Thomas. He's going to be the wide receiver 1 coming off the board in 2020, as he should be, and I'm fine with it. But yeah, this was just an amazing year for guys like Michael Thomas and a couple other guys we're going to mention, and Chris Godwin here in a minute as well. So wide receivers were a big deal, I think, in 2020.
Well, that's my segue to the shockingly good then, because this is Joe's first victory lap. Chris Godwin at number 2 is the first on my list for shockingly good. Joe, go ahead, start your lap.
So we did that wide receivers episode that I talked about earlier on. And I believe maybe it was in a different episode, but we talked about a buy or sell. Chris Godwin could be the number 1 wide receiver in Tampa Bay. And I said buy. I talked about all of the slot receivers in Bruce Arians' offenses throughout the history of his coaching career. And I got laughed off the field. I got laughed at on Twitter. I got laughed at in our Facebook group. And It's just like, it's one of those things where you go back and you look at it and it's exactly what we said on this show was going to happen. Like, I get it. Mike Evans was still very good. At one point, they were both top 4 wide receivers. But Chris Godwin was the 1A in this offense. He was the primary read, and Mike Evans was the deep threat. And it worked really, really, really well.
Yeah, it did work very well. I think Mike Evans was even more than a deep threat, though, because, he caught 67 balls. He played, I think one less game than Chris Godwin did. On 118 targets to Godwin's 120. Like, they were both unbelievable. And look, from a fantasy standpoint, Chris Godwin this year was absolutely the wide receiver 1 for this team. I still think in a real life scenario, Mike Evans is that number 1 guy, but it's semantics. These guys were absolutely phenomenal. They're going to continue to be phenomenal as long as Arians is running that show. So Chris Godwin, for me, I was not wide receiver 1 high on Chris Godwin. Like, I was definitely wide receiver 2, and it was like high wide receiver 2, because there were a lot of people that, when we go into fantasy years, and obviously there's a lot of players that have this ton of hype. Like, we saw it with, 2009, CJ Spiller. Like, he had all this hype, and everybody was like, we're going to run him into the ground, and he's going to be amazing. Everybody was expecting to be RB1. And obviously he fell flat on his face. A lot of people thought that this was going to be the same thing, but it was different. The Chris Godwin, we saw he always had that sort of talent. He always was in the mix for that role. And when Arians came along and came to town, this was what he wanted to do, and this was what we thought that Chris Godwin was going to do for the most part. I never thought he was going to be wide receiver 2 good.
Nobody did, including me. I had no clue.
Not even top 10 wide receiver. There was a point though where his hype, his ADP started rising to an alarming level. And that's kind of where I was like, I don't know. I kind of want to play it a little bit safe here. But look, it ended up, if you took the chance on drafting him at that, alarming ADP, you got obviously a great value for what it ended up being pretty much all season long. It's not like Chris Godwin just appeared and he was good. Chris Godwin has been, if you paid any attention to Chris Godwin coming out of Penn State, he was an absolute just monster coming out of Penn State. He was phenomenal, had all the talent in the world. He's just dripping with it. He just didn't get the opportunity that he got, obviously, in this Arians offense and toward the end of last year. We saw it toward the end of last year anyway when he had several big games. Like, Chris Godwin is just an amazing talent. I think this is a guy that is definitely going to be in that wide receiver 1 mix again in 2020. I don't think I'd be buying as like wide receiver 3. I'm not going to do that again.
I'm not buying. I'll actually sell him in Dynasty for the right price.
I can get behind that. I can get behind that because I think a lot of people are going to be willing to overpay. But yeah, look, he's phenomenal, and I can't really blame anybody for being that high on him. Like, he didn't score a touchdown the last 3 weeks he played, but he was a target hog. You know what I mean? And he was obviously just a yardage monster, just a chain mover, a producer for this offense. Chris Godwin's phenomenal. I think he's going to have another great 2020. I see him more of on the wide receiver 2 radar right now. But wide receiver 2 overall, Chris Godwin had an amazing 2019.
All right, so other guys on the shockingly good list, and most of these guys have a despite next to their name. Allen Robinson, despite Mitch Trubisky. Devontae Parker, despite Miami. Courtland Sutton, despite Joe Flacco. And then everybody else. A.J. Brown, despite having 6 games of Marcus Mariota. DJ Moore, despite having to prove that he was the one. DJ Chark, despite Nick Foles. And Terry McLaurin, despite Washington. I'm just going to put Washington as the response there. All these wide receivers really did a great job emerging with kind of bad stuff going on around them. My favorites out of this list, Courtland Sutton had a lot going for him. A.J. Brown was a phenomenal rookie. And Terry McLaurin, despite what he had to deal with, had a pretty solid fantasy season at wide receiver 29. Those are my favorite names. And Devontae Parker finally had the breakout.
Yeah, I think we just learned a lesson here with these guys that when you look at situation and you put too much stock into the situation for the player, you're doing yourself a disservice because it matters. It obviously matters a ton. But when we were talking about 3 top 20 wide receivers for the LA Rams, and we had basically all of these guys as the fantasy community at consensus wide receiver 3s or worse, like we did it wrong. We honestly did it wrong, and everyone did. I don't know more than a handful of people that had any of those guys you just mentioned inside their top 15 at wide receiver.
Yeah, I certainly didn't. This year, I kind of had to issue an apology to Allen Robinson because Allen Robinson I had ranked a little low as well. I thought this was going to be the year that Anthony Miller really took that next step up. Now, he did toward the end of the year, so we'll see what happens in 2020. I like him going into 2020 a little more. But Allen Robinson proved to be the alpha. He proved to be the guy. I will never doubt him again. And again, that was despite Mitch Trubisky and the issues that this offense had for the majority of the season. Allen Robinson was that mainstay on this offense, even when the running game could not get going with Tariq and Montgomery. So Allen was phenomenal. Devontae Parker was solid as well. You know, he was a guy, I loved him coming out of college. Absolutely loved him coming out of Louisville. And I bought him that first year. I drafted him in so many dynasty leagues that first year. That second year, he still didn't do much. And that's when I sold after a year too. And the light bulb just did not turn on. Like the light switch didn't flip for him. And it seemed like coming into 2019, like you guys know, I was in love with who else? Preston Williams. I think to this day, Preston Williams to me was the most all-around complete, most polished wide receiver in this draft. And he went undrafted. Like this was a guy that I was talking about all offseason long that needed to be on your dynasty squad. And he obviously, worked out for his first year until he got hurt. I think I still think he is the wide receiver to own in Miami moving forward. But if you got Devontae Parker, congratulations, because you got one hell of a steal. You got, in a lot of cases, a league winner for a lot of people. And I think you got a guy going into 2020 that you can say, all right, that was nice, but I'm going to sell high. And I think he is one of my biggest sell high players, not just at wide receiver, but overall for the entirety of 2020, to be honest with you, because I'm not yet convinced that he is going to continue this on, for the rest of his career or, for the next couple years. I'm just not convinced yet. I'm just kind of playing it safe. Miami was down a lot. They were competitive a lot. Obviously Devontae Parker was going to get more volume when Preston Williams went down. That's when everything, started to improve for him even more. So look, that's impressive because you don't have a very talented player across from you taking away that coverage. So you are the guy. So despite all that, Parker was still able to perform at a very high level. So hats off to him for that. I'm not taking anything away from him, but I do think from a fantasy standpoint, this is one of my biggest sell points in 2020.
Yeah, I agree with you because people are going to be buying Mike Gesicki. They're buying on Preston Williams. They're buying on Devontae Parker. And maybe Fitzmagic comes back and throws 600 times again, but I'm not banking on that. I think this team is going to get better.
Sure.
And there's going to be fewer pass attempts in this offense. And they have the 5th pick. Are they going to draft Tua? Where is their quarterback situation going to be? I think that I'm a buyer on Preston Williams because I think his price is going to be low, but I think that the hype is going to be too high on too many pass catchers in this offense.
I can agree with that. I can get on board with that. And Preston, I'll be honest with you, Preston's going to be the only guy that I really buy a lot of stock into. But that's just, I think his price is going to be nice, to be honest with you, just his alone. I think Gesicki's might be a little bit higher than I'd like for a tight end. And I think that Parker's is going to be way too high than I would like. So another thing that a lot of people aren't thinking about, running back. They're going to take a running back in the draft. They're going to sign one in free agency. They're going to do something significant at running back. They need to have a running game. They didn't have a running game. So that's another reason why they were throwing so much to Parker. So I think there's a lot of, I feel like manufactured stats, manufactured output is a little harsh, but it's really the best way that I can think to put it. And I think all of those things are not going to line up the same way in 2020 that they did it this year in 2019 for Parker. And so that's one of the biggest reasons. You got to look at who they're going to take at running back because they're going to make a big move there at some point, somehow, some way, and they're going to want to run the football a little bit more, I think. So we'll see what happens there, but I think this is an offense that, okay, yeah, it got you where you wanted to go in the fantasy playoffs if you had Parker and Gesicki, but other than that, it's sell time in 2020, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, Devontae Parker wasn't bad for the first half of the season. He was, like a low-end wide receiver 3.
Yeah.
But it was really when Preston Williams went down,
everything changed.
He really skyrocketed. He was wide receiver 2 from that point on. So that's not something that I think we can expect. Like, maybe he's the alpha in that offense, but I think even at that point, he's still not wide receiver 2 or top 10 wide receiver, probably.
Yeah, and I want to check on something here because I want to see if this sort of correlates at all. And I think it does. You just mentioned that Parker, his production obviously started going up, almost twofold when Preston went down. Preston was available in 9 games. When did they trade Kenyon Drake? Week 9.
Yep.
So from week 10 on, you were sans Preston Williams, you were sans Kenyon Drake. And I look, correlation does not equal causation, but I mean, at the same time, like, that is a lot of evidence to tell you that had a lot to do with, this production that Devontae Parker had, and the fact that Miami was not only more competitive after, finally, kicking Josh Rosen to the curb or to the bench, permanently, but also they had just kind of gotten into a groove and a rhythm with Ryan Fitzpatrick. And we've seen how aggressive of a passer he is. And when they lost Kenyon Drake, they lost, any semblance of a running game they had. So they had to throw to stay competitive. And the tank for Tua thing was always a joke. Teams just don't do that. It's a fallacy. It's ridiculous. But yes, I think those two things directly affected what happened with Devontae Parker. So if you're going into 2020 saying, man, I'm going to go in my redraft league, I'm taking Devontae Parker as my wide receiver 1 or my wide receiver 2, I think you're going to have a bad time.
All right, next up, the guys that were what we expected. DeAndre Hopkins, wide receiver 5, exactly what we expected. Keenan Allen, wide receiver 6. These guys are elite, and they stay up there. Cooper Kupp, wide receiver 4. Mike Evans with some injuries and such, wide receiver 15. And Jarvis Landry, still a PPR monster at wide receiver 12. Do we need to really talk about these guys? They are just the elite guys that we know are elite.
Did Cooper Kupp not have the most underwhelming wide receiver 4 season you've ever seen?
I was just getting ready to mention it. Like, you're right. He did. It was like
he was great when he was great, but he had so many games where he just completely disappeared. Like, have you ever seen a season that didn't involve like a substantial injury where a player finished as the 4th best player at their position for fantasy, where they had a goose egg when they were active?
Yeah, it's like you go back and you look, week 1 through week 8. It's like every single week he was absolutely just killing it. He was getting double-digit targets, it seemed, every week. He was hitting over 100 yards every single week. He was in the end zone almost every week. Like, his week 1 through 8, was phenomenal. And then you had the bye week in week 9. He came out of the bye week, and that's when the rut started. You hit that 3-week rut where it was like, week 10 at Pittsburgh, no catches on 4 targets, nothing. Complete goose egg. Week 11 at Chicago, 3 receptions, 3 targets, 53 yards, no end zone. I think he actually had 2 fumbles in that game as well. Baltimore, and these are all home games, by the way, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Chicago, Baltimore, 6 receptions. There were 10 targets here. There were opportunities, 35 yards. And then Arizona is finally where he got it together, where, he had 6 catches, 65 yards, a touchdown. He had a touchdown in every single game the rest of the year from week 13 to week 17. So he really saved his season, those last, 4 or 5 weeks. But man, I mean, that was a rough rut. I had so much stock in Cooper Kupp in Dynasty, and it was terrible. That 3-week, rut that he was in. And, all players go in ruts, and that's fine, and it happens, and he came out of it. Surely Tyler Lockett surely had one as well. But man, Cooper Kupp was
kind of
wild.
more like 6 weeks for Cooper Kupp, though. Like, he had that 135-point game against Cincinnati sandwiched in between them all, but he had 4 single-digit games out of 6 weeks.
Yeah, the Atlanta game in week 7 was not any good. So you're right. Like, he put up that, pretty much that bad fantasy game, and then erupted and then disappeared for 3 or 4 more weeks.
All right, on to the bad guys, the players that just did not perform well. And the most of this list is injury. Odell Beckham Jr., wide receiver 25, dealing with a hernia / groin injury most of the year.
Freddie Kitchens.
Slash
Baker Mayfield.
Devontae Adams, wide receiver 22, of course, missed several games with injury. Tyreek Hill, same story, wide receiver 32, still several games with injury. And Robbie Anderson, the only guy on this list that's not been bitten by the injury bug. Just a weird year for him. Jamison Crowder's emergence didn't really help him at all. That Adam Gase, I'm going to say that Adam Gase. That'll be my excuse.
Yeah, I mean, he did play quite a few games with like college level quarterbacks too.
That's fair too, yes. Damn that mono.
Yeah, that didn't help
things. That was
things.
the worst. Like, Sam Darnold actually had a decent year this year. Like, it wasn't great, but he showed some things again that make me think this passing game could be relatively good. I just worry that Adam Gase is never going to let it get there.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest with you. The Jets wide receivers, they don't excite me. They don't really do much for me. I mean, Jamison Crowder, I think, is a solid sort of Cole Beasley-esque wide receiver. Like, he's a solid safety blanket underneath and the short yardage passing game. But outside of him, like I'm not buying into Robbie Anderson as a number one guy. I think we mentioned John Brown not long ago, about being that, or I think it was last night in last night's show, we mentioned John Brown about being that, alpha number one guy. I just think him and guys like Robbie Anderson are better suited to be that number two guy and to be that
John
complement.
Brown is way better than Robbie Anderson.
I think he's better, but I still think he's in that same. I mentioned the Batman. I think he's more of that Robin wide receiver. I think he needs a Batman wide receiver across from him. I think the same thing for Robbie Anderson. They need to go out and they need to get an alpha number one guy. Sam Darnold needs it. Look, I agree. Sam Darnold, I think, improved in a lot of areas. There's still some ways that he needs to improve as well. The number one thing that needs to change, as Murphy hit on, it's Adam Gase. Adam Gase needs to go. He's a terrible head coach. He's a terrible coach, in and of itself. So I'm not buying any Jets receivers. Adams, obviously, a little bit of a down year as well. But I'm not really selling him at all. Same thing with Tyreek Hill. That's more of an injury thing. And then Odell Beckham, though. Joe, Odell Beckham, to me, I'm buying Odell Beckham actually for 2020. I think he's going to be fine. He's an elite top 5 receiver in this league, I think, in totality, as far as skills concerned. Obviously, Freddie Kitchens had a lot to do with the lack of fantasy output. He had a couple good games, and then pretty much everything else was he just wasn't there. So he was kind of a waste of a draft pick. There was a redraft league where I took him and I think it was Julio Jones back to back. And I was like I remember feeling so good about that team. And I'm like, Phillip Lindsay and Devin Singletary were my top 2 running backs. And I was like, I'm good. I got Odell Beckham and Julio Jones. Are you kidding me? Julio, I got everything out of that I wanted to for the most part. But Beckham really just kind of crapped the bed. And so I'm buying him. I think a lot of people might be selling him. I think you're going to be able to get him at a decent price. I'm not crazy. You guys know my feelings about Baker Mayfield. I don't think he's a franchise quarterback. I honestly don't even think he's that great of a quarterback. But hopefully he improves a little bit with a new head coach, a new offensive system. I think this is going to be his, 3rd or 4th offensive system and head coach as well. So that's never good, usually for a quarterback, a young quarterback. So that worries me a little bit. We'll see if Beckham's even going to be there. He claims he wants to be. I would imagine he does with his best friend, Jarvis Landry. I think Jarvis is going to be fine, but it does worry me a little bit about Odell, but I think the price that you'll be able to get him at the discount, I'm buying it. He's not going to go as a top flight wide receiver 1. I think at the worst, he'll go as a back-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2.
I'm a bigger buyer on Adams, though. You know how many players outscored Adams from the game that he came back until the end of the season from that turf toe injury?
Enlighten me.
Like 3.
1, Michael Thomas. He was the only one that had more points per game than Devontae Adams from week 10 on.
Yeah, he's definitely a better buy than anybody else on this list, to be honest with you.
And people are going to be people are looking at him as like a mid-level wide receiver 1. And I honestly think in this offense, he still has number 1 overall upside at the position.
100%. And I won't expect that from Devontae Adams, but I do think if he's on the field, he is an elite fantasy wide receiver 1. I think he's got a couple more years at least left in that, if not more. I don't see why not. And so, like I said, as long as he stays healthy, like you mentioned, he's going to be just fine. So I'm a huge buyer on Devontae. I'm right there with you. So we're lock and step there. So yeah,
he's only 27.
Yeah, so he's still very young. So
he's in his prime.
Yeah, he's in his prime. And so I think, this is definitely going to be a buy area for guys like Beckham and guys like Adams. Obviously, Adams more than anybody because he's got Aaron Rodgers. He's got, I think a solid head coach. He's in a great system for him. They don't really have, the only thing I could see maybe hurting Adams is getting without a rock solid, unquestioned number 2 guy.
That helps. Have you seen how much he gets help over the top?
I don't know. I don't know that it will help. I just don't know, because I think obviously you see that Allison's not the guy. MVS is not the guy. Lazard is probably not the guy. Jimmy Graham is not the guy at tight end. And Jake Sternberger's probably not going to be the guy at tight end. So right now he is getting all that volume. He's getting all this work. If you get a guy that has, like a Calvin Ridley across from him, I think he's still going to be fine. I think he's still a wide receiver 1, but I don't know that he has the upside and the volume that he does right now.
You just need a field stretcher. Like if you get a field stretcher that gets 80 targets on the season, I'm still a buyer on Devontae Adams at mid wide receiver 1 price.
I'm on board with that. 100%. And now like a guy like CeeDee Lamb coming out of Oklahoma, he's not going to be there for Green Bay more than likely. He's going to go in the first round, but he's probably not going to be there for Green Bay. Green Bay may have to move up to get a guy like that. But that's the type of guy. I agree. A type of, Robbie Anderson, John Brown sort of field stretcher. If you could go get a reliable number 2 wide receiver to Devontae Adams that can, we just talked about it with the Bills. Devontae Adams can work at every layer of the field, but he's not that field stretcher. Michael Thomas isn't that field. He's more of a Michael Thomas sort of wide receiver. He's going to work.
And Ted Ginn matters to that offense. Ted Ginn makes Michael Thomas better.
100%. And Ted Ginn he's not even as good as John Brown. But he matters to the offense.
But he matters.
Yes, he makes it matter. And so I'm 100% on board with you there. I think that would be the ideal fit. I'm not saying they need to go out and get another guy like Devontae Adams. That would, I think, would be worst case. But if you get a guy that can stretch that field and add another...
get your Marvin Jones.
Yes, Marvin Jones. That's another... Marvin Jones to Kenny Galladay. That's a great comparison, I think. So yeah, if you can get that field stretcher, the reliable field stretcher, I'm not talking about like a Devin Smith or a John Ross you can never rely to be on the field. I'm talking about a reliable downfield threat, like a Deshaun Jackson. Yes.
Curtis Samuel even fits this bill.
Curtis Samuel fits the bill. Yes. But a guy that has to stay healthy and can give you that quality production, that would just do amazing things for this Green Bay offense.
All right, and finally, the players whose value aren't shown in the final rankings. Chris, you actually hit on most of them in your last discussion. John Brown, wide receiver 20. Jamison Crowder, wide receiver 26. Cole Beasley, wide receiver 34. And I put Deebo Samuel in here at wide receiver 31. He started breaking out a lot more towards the end of the season. Most of these guys provided pretty solid wide receiver 2 value for you, especially in the long stretch. So
I mean, John Brown was a wide receiver 1 for like the first 12 weeks of the season. He was fantastic.
Yeah, consistent as hell.
Yeah, these are guys that I do see as more of wide receiver 2s moving forward. There's going to be some changes on offense. The Jets should absolutely add a receiver. We'll see how that affects Jamison Crowder. The Bills should add a receiver. We'll see how that affects Beasley. And John Brown for that matter. Deebo Samuel, I'm not buying him as a wide receiver 1 in fantasy or in reality. I love Deebo Samuel. I think he's going to be a big part of the offense. I think he's going to be, for the most part, a consistent sort of option. But here's how I kind of view Deebo Samuel. You guys know that I love Christian Kirk in Arizona. He was my number 1 wide receiver coming out of that class, and I still think he has got arguably some of the most overall talent out of that class. However, I have accepted the fact he is an outside wide receiver. Everybody said he wasn't. He is. But I don't think he's that wide receiver 1. He's not that alpha guy. I don't think Deebo Samuel is either. But I think he and Christian Kirk are sort of that same sort of, you can move them all over the line of scrimmage, do a bunch of different things with them. They're very explosive, and they're very reliable guys. That's kind of how I see Deebo Samuel. So I guess not the most consistent week to week from a fantasy perspective, at least at this point in time. But I think they both need sort of that alpha wide receiver 1. That's sort of the talk now, I guess, in these last 2 episodes. But I think Deebo kind of needs a guy like that. So I think his offense needs that. But if they don't add that, man, you got to be all over Deebo Samuel.
they're not getting it if they don't get it in the draft either, because they only have $16 million in cap space. You can't even afford to pay for 1 year at that point.
They're strapped. I know.
All right, guys, that'll do it for the wide receivers episode. Chris, we'll have to get to those buy and sells next time you have on the show, which will likely be soon.
100%. I'm 100%. But we got all summer to do buys and sells, right? Like there were in no rush to do that. So that'll be another great episode to do. So guys, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. It was a blast. All
right, guys. Until next week, for Joe at Human Stat Sheet on Twitter, for of course our boy Jeff at NFL_DiMatteo. We'll see him next week. For Chris at Mine and McConnell on Twitter, and of course myself at Mur50. We'll see you next time. Bye, guys.
Later.
Thanks for listening to the Fantasy Takeaway Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And follow the show on Twitter at FF Takeaway.